Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. I'd like to start a series of lectures on Vietnam, but with permission from our Vietnamese colleagues, I think it's best if I speak mostly in English, because we are recording this for Vietnam Center to make a series of DVDs. And the hope is there could be, because there really isn't anything out there, a series of DVDs which people can use in their homes, they can give in schools, you can put in libraries, and many people can learn something about the history of Vietnam. Because one of the great tragedies, it's not a tragedy, I think it's just a terrible wrong, that across all of America, there's basically very little taught in the way of Vietnamese history. Few college professors here and there, but basically very little in high schools or for Americans of all backgrounds to understand. And that, particularly given the significance to the United States of the Vietnam War and the presence in the United States now of over 1 million Vietnamese, that seems to me sort of inexcusable. But there it is. So Vietnam Center is trying to make a contribution in this way, and I think doing it in English will be most helpful for the larger cause of educating many people, younger Vietnamese who were born and raised here, who maybe speak English better than Vietnamese, and Americans who don't speak Vietnamese at all. However, if anybody has a question, please ask it in Vietnamese, or I'll be using Vietnamese phrases from time to time, just because it has the special ring and magic and the special power, and I'll try to talk about those phrases in English. So again, thank you very much for coming on a beautiful day with blue sky and no rain and nice temperature and spring, mùa xuân. Springtime has many positive connotations for Vietnamese in particular, particularly for people on a lunar calendar. Vietnamese, like the Chinese, the Koreans in particular, operate on a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar, but with 4 seasons, spring, summer, fall, and winter. One of the things we will get into today is the association of everything with the flow of a cosmic force, with the flow of a great power of destiny, which is understood as something like qi in Chinese. Some of you may have studied something about Chinese yin-yang theory or something like that, qi in Vietnamese. And this force, this power, this substance, this energy exists in 2 phases, yin and yang, or and dương in Vietnamese, and everything, whether it's the weather or us or our fate or things that happen, whether it's rainy or sunny, it's all somehow driven by and dương, yin and yang, and the 4 seasons reflect the flow of yin and yang. Now, I raise this because this is a very, very, very powerful and important point about the Vietnamese. Because there are a lot of similarities between Vietnamese culture and Chinese culture. There are many loan words in Vietnamese which came from the Chinese. The Chinese ruled Vietnam for 1,000 years. We will talk about that today. And there was Chinese intellectual influence for the 1,000 years after that. But the fundamental point, and the point I want to emphasize today, is that the Vietnamese are not Chinese. And one of the factors for this is that this yin-yang thinking probably came from the south of what is today's China. It probably was created by the people who lived south of the Yangtze River. If we can imagine a map of China here, we have Beijing up at the top, and there's a big river, the Yellow River, that kind of flows like this. Then where the bulge of China is, there's Shanghai, and there's a great big river, the Yangtze River, which flows from the Himalaya Mountains all the way down through and out into the ocean at Shanghai. Now, north of that river were the ancient Han people, the Chinese ethnic people, down to about 200 BC. South of the Yangtze River were other people, not Chinese. And this yin-yang thinking is caught up very much in the I Ching. Some of you may have known about the I Ching, and they have the hexagrams, the 6 lines, solid lines, broken lines, and that's a fortune-telling device. The first set of hexagrams, according to mythology, was found on the back of a turtle. Now, north of the Yangtze, there are no big turtles. So if you're going to have a big turtle on its back, you find these things, and the ancient mythological kings did. That turtle probably had to live south of the Yangtze, which meant that turtle came from a culture, and yin-yang thinking came from a culture which was not Han Chinese. So something has been going on south of the Yangtze River for thousands of years, which has been very important, very powerful, and very influential, because its thinking went north. Now, the yin-yang thinking is also associated with Taoism. And Taoism is a philosophy that some Chinese came up with. But Taoism then also moved in to adopt yin-yang thinking. So Taoism is also associated with things to the south. The next point. Who lived south of the Yangtze? According to the old Chinese text, and I think most everybody agrees on this, the people there south of the Yangtze River, all the way down to here, were called Yue in Chinese, or Viet. They were also called by the Chinese Bai Yue or Bat Viet, the 100 Viets. They were, so Viet is some kind of identification of a culture and some sort of language. And at one point, it applied to all the people living from about where Shanghai is now, a little bit south of that. Shanghai was the old state of Wu. South of Shanghai, all the way down through the Red River Delta in North Vietnam to somewhere along in here. These were called the Viet peoples. Now, briefly, what happened was that all the Viet peoples north of this line here, which is a mountain range, all the Viet peoples to the north were conquered by the Chinese and became quasi-Chinese. The Viet peoples here did not accept Chinese culture and continually fought for their independence. And in 1939 AD, they defeated a Chinese army. And after that, the Chinese basically stayed out. So one of the big themes of Vietnamese history is the autonomy of the Vietnamese against the Chinese and against all other peoples in the world. The Vietnamese of here developed a very special, unique identity and set of beliefs. Now, this is important because you cannot have a national state, a country, unless you have something sort of unique, something that makes you different from other people. Well, what do we have that's different from different peoples? First of all, obviously, language. French or French, German or German, English is English, Russian is Russian, Vietnamese is Vietnamese. Now, languages can borrow from each other. For example, if you take the English language is composed of two main groups of words and concepts. One main group is the old Latin, goes back to Rome. The other main group is German. And French is a sort of Romance language from the Latin. But because of the different waves of conquest of England, the English language emerged as an Anglo-Saxon German language, which then picked up French, and from French it picked up a lot of Latin. So that the English language has a melange of different backgrounds, but in that unique combination, like a special sauce, it created an English identity. So the English always feel they're different from the Scots, the Welsh, the French, everybody else. Same thing happened in Vietnam. If we find Chinese loanwords in Vietnam, that's because they've been brought over and adopted and customized and fit within a Vietnamese way of thinking. So first is language. Second, obviously, is food. Special foods are very important to people's sense of who they are. Vietnamese cooking is different from Thai cooking, different from Japanese cooking. Japanese cooking is different from other cooking. Another thing we often talk about is dress. Different people tend to have different, so they like different colors, they like different sort of costumes. The Vietnamese had their own versions of costumes which were similar to Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. But if you know, the Japanese take the notion of a gown and do something very formal and complicated with it. Think of the kimono worn by Japanese women. Very complicated, developed in a Japanese way. The Vietnamese took the same notion of this gown and turned it into an áo dài in more recent times. Áo is dress, dài is long. You see Vietnamese girls and women wear a front panel and a back panel. A cut, you sort of attach it on the side, and you wear pants. They figured out their own system. Next, about an identity is some sense of a belief system, something akin to a religion, something that says we have something special about ourselves. For the United States of America, it's primarily the story of the Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, a political theory about freedom and liberty. For the Japanese, it's a sense that they are descended from the sun goddess, Amaterasu. For the Chinese, they have their own sense of being the central kingdom, Trung Quốc. They're the central kingdom right under heaven, and they've developed the most sophisticated thinking about heaven, about life, about death, and things like that. So that makes them Chinese and very important. Now, what I want to talk about today is the Vietnamese sort of self-concept. What makes Vietnamese Vietnamese? Why are they different? And how powerful is this perception of value and behavior? Very powerful. It is a force which in the modern times we call nationalism, but it's ancient, very ancient, older than modern Western nationalism, which then has sort of gone to other parts of the world in the 20th century. We need to get some sort of a sense of Vietnamese-ness, something that makes Vietnamese Vietnamese. And so they can tell when they're interacting with people who's with them, who's like them, and who's sort of different. And I think all of us, we have this experience. When we meet somebody who comes from a different cultural background, in language and voice and thought, expressions, feelings, reactions, we sense, well, they're a little bit different from we are. And in the United States, we have lots of ethnic groups. So we all sort of have these experiences. But a Vietnamese-ness would be something like if you're Vietnamese and you run into, let's say, another Asian, you run into someone from Thailand, or someone from, or a Lao, or a Hmong, or a Cambodian, or a Filipino. You just get a sense, well, they're kind of different. They don't quite think the way I do. They don't have the same sense of emotional reactions, highs and lows. Their language is different. They don't have this particular concept. For example, I can give the Vietnamese, I can give all of you a Thai concept, which is very powerful for the Thai. It's called Greng Jai. Probably nobody in this room knows what Greng Jai is, doesn't even know how to respond to it, wouldn't know a Greng Jai feeling from a non-Greng Jai feeling. Well, that's the same thing in Vietnamese. There are many ideas and special things in Vietnamese which they just resonate to, and other people don't. Why is this important? Well, I think it's important for two reasons. One, it's important just because it helps us understand a different culture and a different people who have been around for thousands of years. Secondly, it, particularly for America, it explains the Vietnam War. And that, for Americans and for the Vietnamese who are over here, is a pretty important thing. How can we understand the Vietnam War, which for the United States was basically 1954 to 1975? It also, this same concept of Vietnamese-ness, will explain contemporary international politics. Like, what should our policy be towards Vietnam today? What is going on in Vietnam today? How do we relate to Vietnam today? Well, the big issue in Vietnam today is probably an issue of nationalism, which is resistance to the Chinese. Because the Chinese are now, in a very sophisticated way, in a very new way, trying to dominate Vietnam. They've demanded that the Vietnamese and the Communist Party has agreed, give some territory up here. They've demanded that the Chinese rights in the Gulf of Tonkin be moved over here. They have leased huge acres of land from here all the way down here in the forest. They have rights to mine bauxite up in here. They are mentoring the Vietnamese secret police. So there's a great influence by this current Chinese government cooperating with the current Vietnamese government to bring basically a large degree of Chinese domination. So that the Vietnamese government, for example, before any senior Vietnamese leader goes to Washington to meet with Americans, they have to first go talk to the Chinese. Or if they go to Washington, then they have to come back and then they have to go up to Beijing and report to the Chinese what they told the Americans. Or if, let's say, the prime minister is going to go to Washington, then the deputy prime minister, he goes up to Beijing to talk to the Chinese. So there's a degree of influence which is remarkable. And a lot of the Vietnamese people today are very angry about this and very frightened by this. Why? Because they think they are Vietnamese and they want to be independent. Now, let me give you some examples of some very dramatic ways in which the Vietnamese have done, as we say in English, their own thing, which nobody else has done. First of all, in the area of religions, there have been in recent times some uniquely Vietnamese religions. In the past, in Buddhism, there was a particular Zen-like sect called the Truc Lam sect of Buddhism, which was started by some Vietnamese kings of the Trung dynasty. It was a kind of Buddhism which reflected some of these core Vietnamese values and beliefs. And just like Zen developed in China and Japan slightly differently, the Vietnamese developed something differently. If we get down to modern times, in the 19th century, we have the sect of Bu Sung Ki Hung in the Mekong Delta, which are the provinces down here. A man had a religious experience, Duc Te Tayang, and he came up with a poem which you can read it in various ways. It has deep meanings. It's a branch off of Buddhism. Now, out of his tradition, down here in the Seven Mountains area in 1939, a young man, 19 years old, by the name of Win Fu Shou, was up on a mountaintop and had a mystical experience and came down and wrote the Samyang, which is a long poem about quasi-Buddhist religious instruction. And some people call it a Protestant Buddhism, in that it's a Buddhism you can practice in your house by yourself. You don't really need a temple, you don't really need a priest. It's a Buddhism which focuses in your own internal ethics, morality, character, your goodness, and it has the four debts. A good person, starting with Bu Sung Ki Hung, going to the Wahao, you have to respect your parents, you have to respect Buddha and the teachings, and you have to respect and be grateful for the nation and the ancestors. So it is a philosophy about individual good character and responsibility. And he had, this young man started a religion in 1939. By 1945, he had 2 million followers. He had most of the people down here following him. So you have Win Fu Shou, 19 years old, goes up to the mountain, has a deep experience, comes down, writes the Samyang, has other writing. And by the way, to me, this is very hard to, this is, if you can see from the script, this he apparently, it's all rhymed verse. It's all rhymed verse, and apparently he just came down and it just came out. This is not apparently a young man who had spent 30, 40 years, studying ancient Chinese poetry and things like that. So where does the inspiration come from? Where does the talent come from to come up with this? Hà nguồn nghề đã hết đời, phương bà biến chuyển đồi đồi gia khang, nắm mèo khí mèo rõ ràng, khắp trong trấn hà những tràng xiết chỉ. It's all rhymed and it all has meaning. 19 years old. By 1945, it's estimated he had about 2 million Vietnamese following him all around here. I doubt anybody in America has ever heard of him. I doubt very many Americans have heard of the Wahao religion. Why? I'm jumping ahead to something at the end, but to make the case as to why Vietnamese-ness is important. We haven't heard of him because he was assassinated. He was assassinated by the communists in 1947. And one of the arguments as to why they assassinated him was he was a threat. If the Vietnamese listened to him, then they wouldn't follow the communists. And the communists, as a group, were not part of this Vietnamese-ness. The core of the communists, we'll talk about this later, is not from Vietnam. Communism comes from Europe. Communism is a Western ideology that was brought to Vietnam. And the reason why there was a Vietnam War is very simple. The Vietnamese people, coming from this tradition of Vietnamese-ness, don't like the communists. And they don't want to be ordered by the communists and controlled by the communists. So when the communists start killing other Vietnamese, these Vietnamese fight back and start killing communists. And that led to a terribly sad period from late 1945 down to 75 and then subsequently. So this study of why the Vietnamese have their own history, their own culture, their own identity is very important to understanding our times. Now, in politics, the Vietnamese in the 1930s and early 1940s came up with their own kind of political party and political theory, which was not Chinese and it wasn't French. And there were two main schools of this. We'll talk about this in a later lecture, but just to mention it now. One of these schools was called the Dai Viet Quốc Dân Đảng, and their theory was Yung Tap Shin Ton. This is volume 1 of a 2-volume book about political theory, about government, about democracy, about human rights, about families, about everything you need to organize a society and a country in a Vietnamese way. And this was written by a Vietnamese no one had Chua Con? Oh, Zung Tam Sin Ton is it's very hard. That's a good point. Well, this is a good example of something, this concept Shin Ton, well, the two concepts, Zung Tap and Shin Ton, we have to talk about. But Shin Ton is a very Vietnamese concept. There are Chinese characters behind it, but the Chinese don't use this concept. Shin Ton is life, existence, essence, survival, a core being. So this is like the core being of the people. Yung Tap means the people. It's not it's kind of like, it's more than an ethnic group, but it's not a big nation like the United States. Because in the United States, we have many different kinds of people. A Yung Tap is a people who have sort of the same, it's a descent concept. We're all blood relatives somehow. So it's an ethnic concept, but it also is, it's more than a tribe. A tribe is not a Yung Tap. A Yung Tap has got to be bigger, and I would suggest that the claim of a Yung Tap is it has a direct relationship with heaven. A tribe is like down here. It's got to deal with other tribes, bigger tribes, little tribes. But a Yung Tap has the claim to be direct. So the French are a Yung Tap. Germany is a Yung Tap. Japanese are a Yung Tap. Vietnamese debate whether or not the Chinese are a Yung Tap. Because if you have Yung Tap, well, this is very insightful. If you have a Yung Tap, you have something called Yung Tap Tin, which is the spirit of a people. The question is whether the Chinese have a Han Tap Tin. And there are two arguments. One is, yes, the Chinese have a very ethnic sense of themselves. The other argument is no. The Chinese have an ideology based on Confucianism and legalism. So what the Chinese have is a different way of organizing their community. It's not so much on a sense of blood ties and kin ties. I myself, am not sure if that argument is worth having, but Vietnamese argue about that. The second group, and I don't have a copy of their book, was 1941, 1942, is called the Dai Viet Duy Duong, the Duy Duong Party. This was a younger guy, well, I'm sorry, this theory first was put out about 1938 by a guy, Trung Tu An, who was middle-aged. And then another guy, Li Do Ma, in 1941, came up with this theory of Duy Duong. The Duy Duong theory is a very complicated, almost mathematical consideration of all the different states of yin and yang and how they determine what happens in history and the world and how they govern our politics and things like that. It's a very kind of fatalistic political theory, because you're always kind of trying to figure out the movement of history in various ways. And it doesn't see the individual as being able to move history. History moves us, we don't move history. Well, to follow on this other theme about the founder of the Wahao, and we'll talk about this later too, is that the man who started this, the Dai Viet Trung Tuan, he was assassinated by the communists in 1946, and the man who started the Zuizang, Li Doma, was assassinated by the communists in 1946. So here we have three very unique, powerfully unique Vietnamese religions, political philosophies coming out of the Vietnamese tradition, and people in the West never heard about them, primarily because their leaders were killed by the communists. Now, another very unique Vietnamese thing is the Cao Dai religion. The Cao Dai religion was founded in 1924 by some Vietnamese. They were in a group, they were French educated, and they were in a group having seances. Seances, communicating with mystical spirits on a Ouija board, where the spirits would come in and move things around and you'd read messages. And several times this great spirit, this Cao Dai spirit, appears and tells them that I am the great spirit of the universe, and this is what's happening. This is my third reoccurrence, and began to instruct them in principles of religion, in the organization of a religion, and in politics. Now, the Wahao were against the French, the Cao Dai were against the French. The Cao Dai did not have one single leader. They had lots of leaders, who, by the way, were also killed by the communists in '46. Now, for some of you Vietnamese, you may know that the symbol of the Cao Dai is a triangle, right, with an eye in the middle. And that's the eye of heaven, the all-seeing eye of heaven. Now, if any of you have a $1 bill, sometime take a $1 bill and look at the seal of the United States. This is the seal of the United States. And at the top of the pyramid is a triangle with an eye. Now this seal, everything about this seal, comes from the Masons, the organization of the Freemasons, because Washington and Benjamin Franklin and many of the founders were Masons. So when they put their symbolism together, except for the slogan, Novus Ordo Seclorum, that's not Freemason, but the pyramid, the eye in a triangle is the all-seeing eye. Now, a friend of mine, Colonel Cao Jiao, who is the grandson of one of the founders of the Cao Dai religion, told me that some of the Cao Dai founders were actually members of a French Masonic lodge in Saigon in the 1920s. So after the spirit appeared and they're creating this Vietnamese religion, which, by the way, recognizes people like Jeanne d'Arc and Victor Hugo and great spirits of all time, they took this Masonic symbol for their symbol. And in all Cao Dai churches, there's this symbol above the altar. So I'm trying to give you a sense that there's some things that the Vietnamese came up with, which nobody else has. They're uniquely Vietnamese. They're all also, by the way, we don't have time to go into them all, maybe later in other lectures. They're very interesting. They're very complex. They're very intellectually sophisticated. They're quite deep. It takes a lot of time to read and understand. This is not superficial, simplistic stuff of, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, rural people who are just planting rice in the fields or cutting brush in the mountains. Now, why is this also important? The French came to the conclusion in the 1860s and 1870s that the Vietnamese were not unique. The French came to the conclusion and wrote that the Vietnamese were basically little Chinese. And the French came up with this image that some of the Americans may have heard of called the smaller dragon. If China was the great dragon, then Vietnam down here was the smaller dragon. And if the Vietnamese were basically Chinese, then they had no Vietnamese identity. They had nothing special to protect. They had no reason to oppose the French. Right? Why would you want to send the French back to France if you don't have anything, if there's nothing special about Vietnam? So the French were telling themselves and telling other Vietnamese that, no, you're just like the Chinese. We can bring you into the modern world. We French colonialists, we can bring you telegraphs, we can bring you railroads, we can bring you chemistry, biology, physics, math, the literature of France, the greatest civilization the world has ever known. We can bring it to you, and you Vietnamese will thank us, and you'll like us. And because you don't have anything of your own. Now, as we will see in a later lecture, that was superficially understandable by outsiders, by foreigners, because the dynasty that was ruling Vietnam in the 19th century was copying the Chinese. The law code of the Nguyen dynasty, actually I'll bring it to a copy in when we get to that point. The founder of this dynasty, a guy by the name of he took the reign title of Jalong Nguyen Phuc An. He got rid of the old Vietnamese law code. He brought in a law code. It was the Chinese law code. Vietnamese could read Chinese characters. So he brings down the Chinese law code. He makes a couple of changes. He changes the name of the money for fines. If you're fined $10 or $50, in the Chinese law code you're fined 10 Chinese dollars. So he changes that character to like 10 Vietnamese characters. And in the Chinese law code at that point, they made a distinction between Manchu people, because the ruling dynasty in China was from Manchuria. They were Manchus. Made a distinction between Manchu people and Han people, Chinese people. So he took all the references to the Manchu people out, and where it would say Chinese, he just put Vietnamese. So the French arrive, and the law code of Vietnam is exactly the same law code as China. So if you're a stranger and I go to your house and you're dressed in German clothes, I probably can assume, well, you've got some relationship with Germany, right? So the French show up and they see this, and they see a lot of Vietnamese mandarins, elite families, writing in Chinese, doing Chinese poetry, justifying the state, not in Vietnamese terms, but in Chinese terms. And they said, wow, these people they're basically Chinese. Second thing the French said was, what Vietnamese fight about is property. Rich people versus poor people. That's all. That's the way they fight. There's nothing. They're not anti-French. They're not really for Vietnam. The fights are about material things. And they have regional fights. The Vietnamese from the south, Vietnamese from the center, Vietnamese from the north. They don't like each other. They contest each other. They're envious. They're jealous. They're rivalries. They don't cooperate. So we French can come in and we can create a good government, and we can create wealth and help the poor people, and we can moderate the conflict among the Vietnamese. So no one has to study anything special about Vietnam. No one has to pay attention to the Vietnamese language. No one needs to pay attention to anything that's traditionally Vietnamese. You look to two things. You look either to China or you look to France. Now the problem was that almost all the Vietnamese, except a narrow elite, didn't believe this, because they were Vietnamese. And therefore we need to go to the point of what does it mean to be Vietnamese? What I want to talk about is what does it mean to be Vietnamese, and then I want to talk about where does it come from. And that will get us into the ancient origins of the Vietnamese people. Because the substance of being a Vietnamese, of thinking like a Vietnamese, goes back thousands of years to before the Chinese conquest. And then it was refined during the 1,000 years of Chinese rule. So if we can understand that period, which is what I want to talk about today, who are the Vietnamese, where do they come from, what are their beliefs, why are they different, it's then easier to understand all the things that happened over the last 1,000 years. We can think about the year roughly 1000 AD as the dividing point. The date was 939. But roughly the Chinese rule Vietnam from about the time of Jesus to to 1000 AD. The Vietnamese are independent from 1000 AD to the present time. They go through a series of dynasties. Then there's a period of French colonial rule. Then there's independence and war between the communists and the nationalists. The communists win and they're ruling. But I would submit to you that because this Vietnamese-ness is so powerful that the communists are never going to succeed. In fact, the argument there would be they've already lost. In terms of psychology, in terms of culture, in terms of the communists have already lost. They lost about 20 years ago. And even the communist leaders themselves are reverting back to being just Vietnamese who like power and money. And the system in Vietnam today is based all around power and money. The concept we'll talk about, a concept of Te, power, versus the concept of Duc, or morality or honor or decency. Now, what does it mean to be Vietnamese? Well, I suggest that one of the best ways to just put yourself in the middle of Vietnamese-ness is to read this long poem, the Kim Ven Kieu, which this is the translation of Win San Tom. There are various translations available, but in some ways I think Mr. Tom's translation is one of the best. The other thing that's nice, but I don't even know if you can get this book anymore. It's a Yale University Press. But it's very good, I think, to get a book that has the Vietnamese on one side and the English translation on the other. So for example, if you're a younger Vietnamese and basically your English is better than your Vietnamese, you kind of read this and then you go back to the Vietnamese to see, well, how does it sound? What are the words that are used in Vietnamese? And the same thing for sort of Americans. You can sort of look at this and then maybe with a Vietnamese friend, you can get a sense for here. But the beginning of this poem is really powerful and almost everybody knows about it. And it sets out the problem of being a person, and it sets out the problem of politics and the problem of war. This is a poem. You can use this poem to understand and interpret the Vietnam War. The other thing is, in this poem, and its sensibility and its understanding, and the solution given by the poet, it's not American. I mean, we Americans, we just don't, we can read it, we can understand it intellectually, but we don't kind of get it. It's Buddhist. It's deeply Buddhist in a Vietnamese kind of way. And the other thing I want to say about the power of this, both particularly the first one, the first words, in meetings of Vietnamese to talk about politics or something like that, you read these words or you bring these up from memory at the right time, you can get 200 people choking up. Because this is where they live. Either conceptually, intellectually here, or it's just somehow it's in them from their mothers, their fathers, their grandmother, or something like this. So, in Vietnamese. Trăm năm trong cuộc người ta, chữ tài, chữ mệnh, khéo là ghét nhau. Trải qua một cuộc bể dao, những điều trông thế mà đau đớn lòng. So, a rough translation. 100 years, you live 100 years in this life on earth. And the word talent and the word destiny, khéo, cleverly hate each other, mess each other up, go after each other. Talent and destiny. Now these are the two key concepts. Because talent refers to an individual. An individual, and the story, I'll tell you the story, but an individual who has ability. The story is this conflict between talent and destiny, and the protagonist is a beautiful woman, young girl. I mean, not only is she beautiful, not only presumably is she the most beautiful girl in hundreds of miles, she's smart. She's well-read. She's articulate. She's well-spoken. Not only that, she has great character. She's respectful of her parents. She's soft-spoken, she's all this, and not only that, she's artistically talented. She can play the zither in such a way that she can move your heart and soul the way she plays. So here's somebody who basically has it made, right? Beauty, intelligence, good behavior, musical ability. She's got it made. Heaven has blessed her. right? So what happens to her? What's the whole poem basically about? One disaster after, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one thing else. Not only that, she falls in love with a guy who loves her. And not just some ordinary guy, right? He's handsome, he's well-studied, he comes from a well-to-do family. He's like the perfect choice for a son-in-law, right? And they meet each other and they fall in love, and this is great. But what happens to the rest of the poem? One disaster after another. Her father is arrested on false charges. In order to get him out of jail, a marriage is arranged for her, so they get money. So she sacrifices herself to get money to get her father out of jail from the corrupt government, the corrupt mandarins. Only she's not sold into a marriage, she's sold into prostitution. So she's got to be a prostitute. And she has one guy who helps her out, and then his wife comes and beats him up or something like that. And then she falls in love with a military guy who saves her and makes her a queen, but then he loses and he gets killed in the battlefield. Then she wants to commit suicide. She can't even commit suicide because her fate, her karma is not over yet. And she meets a Buddhist nun, and then finally she sort of at the end, she understands that life is tears. Life is suffering. Doesn't matter how smart you are, doesn't matter how beautiful you are. So after she realizes this, basically, then she meets her love from the past, but she's not in a position to really be his wife now. So they marry as kind of a brother and sister, and but actually he's then living with his wife with her younger sister. So that's sort of, we go through all this stuff, and like talent meets destiny. Destiny is against talent. And there's a line in the poem somewhere, by the way, my wife's mother, who, as a daughter of a high-class family about 100 years ago, was not taught how to read and write. Because the concern was if young girls were taught how to read and write, they would read and write letters, not good. They had to be dedicated and loyal within the family. However, she had this whole poem memorized by heart. It's not a short poem. And so what would happen was, if something would happen, all of a sudden she would quote, boom, 3 or 4 lines from this poem, which would make a point to a friend or to kids or something like that, or to her husband, or a comment on politics, something's going on in politics of Vietnam. She says, well, it's just like, and then boom, these lines come out because they're totally memorized. Now, the ending of the poem. Why does talent and destiny clash? And if we have talent and we want to have a good destiny, what do we have to do? Or how do we move destiny? What is the Vietnamese answer to moving destiny? Chú tài, chú mình, đối giàu cả hai. Cả tài mà cái chi tài. Chú tài liên với chú tài một vần, đã mang lấy nghiệp vào thân. Không đúng trách lần trời gần trời xa, thiên gần ở tại lòng ta, chiều tâm kia mới bàn bạ chiều tài. We talk about talent. Why do we waste our time talking about talent? Talent has the same sound as another tai, which means disaster. If we're going to bring a destiny, if we're going to bring a life's destiny on ourselves, don't blame heaven for being far away or for being close. In other words, don't blame heaven for favoring you or disfavoring you. Because the scales of heavenly justice, Tien Kang, the scales of heavenly justice are in our own hearts. The word heart, tam, is worth more than 3 talents. In other words, if you want to be a good person, if you want to be successful in life, you have to be a good person. It's not about power. The essence of Vietnamese-ness is something about people, the quality of people. Got to be a good person. Now the problem is not all of us are so good. One of the issues of Vietnamese-ness is you raised very, very high standards. So you're always looking around to find somebody who can meet these high standards. But it's not a question of your degrees. It's not a question of the talent side. Really, your degrees, your money, your family status, whatever your background is. It's what's inside you. It's a deeply personal feeling. Now, that leads, or the poem raises another issue. I want to talk about the other side for a minute. Talent and destiny. Men. Destiny, fate. This is a key part of Vietnamese-ness. A total belief in the power of fate. There is a destiny for all of us. Now, the destiny, I think, for most Vietnamese is shaped in these two ways. One is how good you are. The other is yin and yang. The powers of yin and yang, over time, in the ground, in us, shape our destinies. So there are some sciences which you may have heard about. One is face reading. It's about how to read the shape of your face. Because the yin and yang that's in you because of your DNA, we would say, has shaped your eyes, your eyebrows, your nose, your ears, your mouth, the width, the height, the proportions. And every one of those things carries with it a consequence. Every one of those features brings in you some combination of yin and yang, which you cannot control. And so another thing Vietnamese like to do is they like to hang out with people who've got the right kind of face. Or if you're voting for a leader, you want the leader to have a right kind of face. Now, I had a friend in Saigon, Vu Tai Lup. I know some of you know him. I think Lup is, I haven't seen him in years. He did escape. He's in California. And he wrote 2 books about face reading. One book was for young women. And the title of the book was How to Choose a Husband. The other book was for young men. And the title of the book was How to Choose a Wife. And it was a discussion of all the different, with different features, right? For a girl, what do the different kinds of eyebrows mean? Now, this is a great problem in modern times. It's a real disadvantage for men because women pluck their eyebrows and shape it their own way. So we cannot know what they're really like. They're parading around in front of us with false pretenses. And Kuzian, who was an old master of face reading, I was the first Caucasian whose face he ever read, and he was quite annoyed at this. That all these young women, he'd be called to, by some family would want him to go read the face of a girl to see if she'd be a good daughter-in-law. And he'd say, what can I say? I mean, she sculpted her eyebrows. And so I don't know whether they're short and bushy or long and thin or whatever. But anyway, assuming you know what the eyebrows are really like, you look at the eyebrows, the eyes, the nose, the ears, the ratios, the proportions, and you can tell if someone is hardworking, lazy, honest, spendthrift, et cetera, et cetera. There was a story, which I believe, that former South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem, before he would agree to the appointment of any person to a high office, that person had to come in and stand in front of him. Not to be interviewed, but Diem just wanted to look at his face. And if Diem felt that the face was a reasonably intelligent, honest face, okay, you get the job. But if Diem saw in the face, just the face, something that he was suspicious of, this guy's going to be corrupt, this guy's stupid, whatever, and he wouldn't get the job. Now, the communists made a big deal over the years of poo-pooing all this Vietnamese stuff. It was feudal, it was obscurantist, it was old-fashioned, it was unscientific, it was un-Western. They got to get rid of it. Well, the communist leadership today and the Politburo believe in this stuff almost more than all other Vietnamese. We had a friend here, and Dama. There was a Vietnamese who lived here for many years, Nguyen Cao Dam. And a number of years ago, he went back to Hanoi for a visit to some relatives, and I met him after that. And he said, Steve, you won't believe it. We were talking about all this fatalism. And he said, well, I was visiting a friend of mine, and he said, across the street is a very famous face reader, one of the most famous face readers in Hanoi. And you'll see all the big shots show up. And just at that point, a black with tinted windows shows up across the street. And this is a poor section of Hanoi. These are small little houses. So this big black car with tinted windows, bodyguard gets out, some guy goes into the house, stays for half an hour, comes back out, car drives off, another black car shows up, tinted windows. So it's a whole procession of these senior communists to go find this old man who reads faces so that they can get their fortunes told. Or the other thing you do is you bring along a picture of somebody else. And you say, tell me about this person. This guy's my rival. How do I get him? What are his weak points? Let me share you a story about this because it's hopefully it'll make the point. Anyway, there was another older Vietnamese man, Mr. Bang, Thai Bang, who was a friend of my wife's family. And he was primarily a geomancer, but his real skill was throwing the I Ching, but he also could read faces a little bit. So he came over as a refugee, and he was coming through New York when we were living in New York. And I had the idea of taking him down to meet the Social Science Research Council in New York City. Now, the Social Science Research Council was the most elite body of our professors in psychology, sociology, anthropology, political science. Now, these were the Americans who had the most established reputations for thinking about how the world works and how people work and how you do politics and organize society and everything. So I thought it would be kind of neat to get these Western minds who think about people with this old Vietnamese guy who reads faces, does geomancy, and throws the I Ching, and also can do some fortune telling, tu vi. So we had the meeting, and Mr. Bang and I are sitting on this side, and the others are there. And a friend of mine who set up the meeting, David Zanton, Mr. Bang is sort of reading Dave's face and sort of talking to him, and he suddenly stops, and he says, "David, do you have a picture of your wife?" And David says, "Oh yes, of course." He takes out his wallet, shows a picture, and Mr. Bang looks at his glasses, sort of like, so looks at his wife, looks at David, looks at his wife, and then he starts talking what to me is almost gibberish. I mean, I couldn't understand it. It was Vietnamese. And I was having a terrible time. I just said, "Oh boy, I'm really embarrassing my friends because I'm not doing a good job translating. Because what's going on?" So I do my best. So we finish up. We're walking out, and I said to Mr. Bang, I said, "I'm very sorry. I did a bad job translating because it was actually it was hard to understand you." He said, "Yeah, I know, Steve, but I was just speaking sort of how did he put it? I was just speaking silly things." And I said, "Oh, why?" He said, "Well, because I saw in his face that he's going to get a divorce." And I looked at her picture, and she's not right for him. So this is a bad marriage. But it's a rule of ethics that in my profession, which I accept, that I shouldn't say this because I could be wrong. I could not read things properly. But if I put in his mind the thought that his wife is not right for him, that could lead through self-fulfilling prophecies to his distancing himself from her and a divorce, which is bad for the family, bad for the kids, and I would be responsible. So I don't want to just put that thought out there. I said, "Oh, that's interesting." So 3 years later, we're up in Boston. The Association of Asian Studies is in Boston. I'm going down to a meeting, long hotel corridor. I see David Zanton coming up. I go over and I said, "David, how are you? How's everything? How's Susie?" And he kind of goes like this. He says, "Steve, you didn't know?" And I said, "No, I didn't know." He said, "Well, we're divorced a year ago." So, the other thing the Vietnamese are good at, though the number of scholars is getting fewer, is geomancy. The famous Vietnamese geomancer was Da Ao, and this is a book on his theory of geomancy. Now, geomancy is the flow of yin and yang in the ground. And you might have, it's become very trendy in interior decorating these days, and particularly in Hong Kong, Singapore, and China. It's called feng shui. Feng shui is feng tui in Vietnamese, so it is geomancy. But to me, the feng shui of these Chinese practitioners and their Western students is pretty superficial. Because as I understood it from these guys, what you're really looking for is not so much the location of things, though presumably it would help, where you would put a bookcase or what colors you'd use in a room or things like that. But what you really want to find is something called a huet. A huet is out there in the ground, and it's where yang energy and yin energy stays on top of each other, mingles together, and stays. It's like a huge battery. And if you're on top of that battery, you're sucking up its cosmic energy, and good things happen. So, for example, you would want your father, grandfather, somebody to be buried. You want the tomb to be right on top of a huet. So if you look around the world at where the Chinese in particular set up their cemeteries, you will find they all like to cluster in certain places, usually around mountains or in the valley or some location. Very important. How many of you have been to China and you've seen the Ming Dynasty tombs? All right, they're all sort of in a circular area around the valley, right? Okay, do you remember when you drive into the tombs, there's a place where you sort of stop and there's like a big stone archway? Okay, that archway, I think, is sitting on top of the Huyet. And this is the most powerful Huyet in North China. And where you place tombs, apparently, is you go, the Huyet is here, you push out sort of in various directions, depending on the yin-yang of the person, depending on their birth date. Now, I once went to see the place where the Qing Dynasty tombs were, because I wanted to look at the geomancy there, and it's not as good as the Ming Dynasty tombs. And the Ming Dynasty was greater and better than the Qing Dynasty. The founder of the Ming Dynasty I talked about in Hui, he had Dao find a tomb site for him, which is very good. His son, Minmang, also had a very good tomb site. The king down Tuduk, very bad tomb site. Wrong place. So you can talk to a lot of Vietnamese, especially around Hue, is that the reason that Vietnam lost out to the French is that Tuduk had bad place for his tomb, because he didn't believe in this geomancy anymore. So I've tried to give you a sense of that there is something very special about the Vietnamese, which comes up in certain beliefs: face reading, geomancy. I haven't talked about fortune telling yet. You get what day, hour of your birth, and how that determines things. Certain unique religions, certain unique political parties. Now, the thing I want to emphasize about the Vietnamese-ness is, because this comes into play with politics, and particularly the Vietnam War, and being Vietnamese. The essence of being Vietnamese, I would argue, is individualism. Vietnamese are actually more individualistic than Americans, and they have been for thousands of years. They are fundamentally an individualistic culture through this concept of fate, where talent and destiny intersect. Because the intersection of talent is one person. It's my talent, it's me. The intersection of destiny is also the individual. And the word the Vietnamese use for this is shou, which means number. So anyway, we have in America, we have this sign, your number's up. Your shou, your fate, your number, your destiny, it's you, it's an individual. Not your family, not your clan, not any larger organization. The essential dynamic of Vietnamese is individualism. This is very different from the Chinese. The central principle of the Chinese is order, getting everybody together in an organized group. The central principle for the Vietnamese is my destiny. And what the poet in the poem Q tells us is that the way we deal with our destiny is through our heart, our emotions. So a second aspect of being Vietnamese is very emotional. They may not express it very much, but very emotional. Just read Vietnamese poetry, read their novels, listen to a lot of their songs. Very emotional and very sensitive to the way other people treat them. Very sensitive, because me, myself, and I'm standing underneath heaven and I'm important. And you all have to know that. And if you don't treat me with proper respect or whatever, that's it between us. There's a song I used to like from the soldier kind of song in the old days, Hum Kung and Mai Lei Wieng. And the girl, Mai Lei Wieng, she sings her part, says, "You're late, you're 5 minutes late, you don't love me, I don't want to see you again." The soldier guy sings his part and says, "Wait a moment, I hit a red light. You know, I mean, give me a break." You know, and she's written him off because he said he was going to be there at 3 o'clock. He's there at 3:05. Fini, right? So there is something powerfully emotional and assertive about Vietnamese, which explains their history and their politics. So let's take a break for a couple of minutes, and then we'll start going into the history. Thank you. Now, in the last discussion, we were talking about individualism as being central to the Vietnamese for thousands of years. One consequence of this importance of individualism for Vietnamese is in politics. The Vietnamese have a concept, Huy Tin, which is the kind of character they look for in some political leader or somebody that they will willingly follow. If somebody has Huy Tin, they will willingly follow them. If you don't have Huy Tin and you want to have power, if you want to be a political leader, then you have to use material incentives. You have to use this thing I call Tay, power. And so Vietnamese politics, to a large extent, is this conflict between people of Huy Tin and people who are just using Tay. And you can use Tay effectively to get what you want, but it's kind of it's like a market transaction. It's a bargaining thing. As long as you have the Tay, then you can get what you want. When you lose your Tay, then you lose your position, authority. People don't listen to you, they don't follow you, they turn away from you. If you have Huy Tin, on the other hand, there's a certain bond, there's an emotional bond. You have tapped into somebody's personal sense of themselves as being trusting you. Now, why are the Vietnamese the way they are? What I want to say now is very controversial, but I think it goes to some deep truths about the Vietnamese which go back to the Bronze Age. The Vietnamese are the way they are because of the mothers. Vietnamese is primarily a mother-focused society, and China really is primarily a father-focused society. Chinese culture, Chinese ideas, Chinese patterns reflect more of a patriarchy. Vietnamese reflect more, not a matriarchy, it's called matrifocal. There's a focal point on the mother. And these things can be explained by different races in history. Patriarchal races in Europe, the Indo-Europeans in particular, were nomads who had horses and who were warrior bands from the steppes of Central Asia. The Chinese who came to put together the Chinese empire and state, the Xia dynasty, the Shang dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, were warrior peoples with horses and chariots from the north of today's China who came south and conquered the area of China above the Yellow River and created the Chinese heartland, and then they moved south across the Yangtze all the way down to here. The Vietnamese are not those people. The Vietnamese are an they call Austro-Asiatic people who live in Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese language is closest to Mon Khmer languages. The Khmer people used to live in this part of Thailand and down here in Cambodia, and the Mon people lived from the western part of today's Thailand over into Burma. The Mon people have almost entirely disappeared. There's a tiny pocket of Mon people left in southern Burma, and there's some descendants of Mon people in Bangkok and one or two other places. The Khmer people have now basically concentrated in Cambodia. A number of the hill tribes in this part of Vietnam and over into Laos are Mon Khmer speaking people. So the Vietnamese are fundamentally a Southeast Asian, Mon Khmer, Austro-Asiatic people. And most of those cultures are matrifocal. The importance of the mother is very significant in these Southeast Asian cultures. In Chinese and northern cultures, it's patriarchic. The Hmong, for example, are a northern people. Hmong legends, origin myths take you way, way up, probably, the legends of the sand. Some people talk about the Gobi Desert or something like that. And we know from Chinese records of about 3,000 years that the Hmong have been moving from the north to the south through the mountains, back away from the Chinese people lived in the valleys, the Hmong were up in the mountains and moved back, ultimately ending up in the mountains of this part of North Vietnam and Laos and over in Thailand. So there are reasons to believe that the Vietnamese, because of the power of the mother, would have a very different psychodynamic. Mothers take care of little babies. Mothers give little babies a sense of importance, especially Vietnamese mothers. Just remember your own youth and look around you. There's a very, very important concept. This is a poem, the Za Wen Ka, which was written by Nguyen Trai, who was a very famous Vietnamese who helped King Lê Lợi defeat the Ming Dynasty in 1428. And then he wrote this poem. He was a great poet, too. He wrote many poems. But this is the poem of family instruction. This is a poem written for women about how to be a wife, a mother, a good Vietnamese woman, and how to raise a family. And it's things like with respect to your parents, with respect to your husband. The one my wife doesn't like is how to be nice to minor wives. That's section 5. Đối với vợ lẽ. How to treat your husband's friends. In other words, be nice to them. Don't throw them out. If your husband brings some friends home, cook some food for them. And how to get along with your relatives. What to do when you're pregnant, and how to take care of your kids. Now here we have perhaps the most important sentence in all of Vietnamese literature and culture. If you want to understand the Vietnamese, this is it. It's Phúc Đức, Tai Mão. Your Phúc Đức comes from your mother. Now we have to talk about Phúc Đức, because Phúc Đức is a concept which is at the heart of being Vietnamese. It's right at the heart of this individualism. Who you are as an individual, what happens to you, good or bad, is largely the consequence of your Phúc Đức. Your Phúc Đức is a concept which combines something sort of Vietnamese and Asian and something Buddhist. Phúc, good fortune, karma is Buddhist. It's a karmic concept. It comes to you from the past. Đức is a basic old-fashioned Chinese word, a Vietnamese word for virtue. Your Đức is, and as the word virtue has in the West, Đức has two concepts to it. Virtue has two concepts to it. Part of it is a set of high ethical standards. You're a good person. Part of it is energy. We talk about the virtue of a hammer is that it can drive nails. Virtue is a power. Virtue is an effectiveness in the world. And the notion of Đức or virtue is that by having character, by being a moral person, by being an ethical person, by having self-restraint, by thinking of good things, that makes you powerful in the world. You can gain control over your fate and destiny through this capacity for Đức, which we saw in the poem Kim Van Q. The heart generates the Đức moves the balance, the scales, the Tien Kung of heaven, and you get a better life. What the Vietnamese say, though, unlike the, say, Thai Buddhists, if you ask Thai Buddhists, because they believe in fate too, Thais are very fatalistic, where does your fate come from in this life? The Thais will say, oh, it comes from me in my past life. What Vietnamese tend to say is, no, it comes from my mother. If my mother was a good, or the mothers behind me, Mao is the female line. I could have a great mother, but if I had a bad grandmother, it's going to be tight. So what happens to me, if I had a good mother, and then I deserve good things. Now, to move ahead to the war between the Vietnamese and the communists, I'm going to call them, they are Vietnamese, but they have different attitudes. And they're more interested in Tay and power than they are in Đức. Anyway, so I'm a landlord. I've studied well. I have some advantages come to me in life. And the communists want to come along and take it away from me because it doesn't fit with their communist theory. What they're telling me is that something that I believe is my natural right, something that I deserve because of my mother or because of me or because of my grandmother. Why should I give it up? Or they come attack me for being a village chief or something like that, or whatever it is. And I know my mother was a good mother, because everybody in the village said she was a sainted person. Why should my mother was a good person, therefore I deserve to have something good. These people are coming along and bossing me around and taking it away. Why should I listen to them? The role of the mother, very, very important. And the power of the mother in the Vietnamese family. There are anecdotes all over the place. There's a little phrase about the wife, the status of the wife, nội tướng. She's the general of the within. Now, the other thing you see, I'm digressing here a bit, is I observe that in the balance of power between the father and the mother, the husband and the wife, there's a kind of compromise between a Chinese model and a Vietnamese model. The Chinese, and we'll get to this in a little bit, imposed the Chinese patriarchy on the Vietnamese. My sense is that way back then, the Vietnamese made a deal. They sort of said, okay, we'll accept patriarchy to some extent, but only superficially. Only to kind of please you guys and to make it work. But we're going to protect in the center of the family, in the heart of the family. That's for the mother. So in society, the men walk first. The men do all the talking. The men are the big shots. They get the big jobs. But at home, who makes all the decisions? It always reminded me of an old story about Americans where these two guys are talking and one guy says, the other guy says, you let your wife step on you all the time. You ought to stand up to her. You're a man. You got to stand up to her. The guy goes back and says, no, you don't understand. I'm the boss at the house. I get to decide what the President of the United States is going to do. I get to decide what we're going to do about the national budget. I get to decide whether we're going to go to the moon or not. And she only gets to decide where we live, where we eat, where the kids go to school, and what clothes I wear. So I can relate to that on various levels. It's not unique to Vietnam, but there is something very special about this power of the mother, and then the mother over the children, and then children growing up with this sense of individualism, with this sense of being special, with this sense of being important, with the sense of having their own destiny, their own particular destiny. Okay. So when did this Vietnamese-ness, when did this Vietnamese culture emerge? I think a long time ago. Now, we have in the ancient history, the Dai Viet Su Ki Thuong Tu, which was first put together by one Mandarin in the Trung Dynasty, and then it was revised by another Mandarin, Ngo Si Liang, in the Lei Dynasty. So it was put together the first time about 1200, and then it was revised in the 1400s. So we're a long time away from the origins, but legends had come down and they were various records. One of the saddest things to me is that in 1428, when the Chinese Ming soldiers and administrators were ruling North Vietnam, and they went back to China, they apparently burned Hanoi, and all the books were burned. And there's also some record that they took some books back to China. But in 500-600 years, no one has found these Vietnamese books in China. So all the written documents, the Vietnamese probably had a lot of written documents from the Lý Dynasty and the Trung Dynasty. They're all gone. We don't have the court records, we don't have histories, we don't have diplomatic files, which is tragic because they probably existed because the Vietnamese were very literate people from early on. They were writing things down, and it's just gone. But anyway, according to the myths, this is mythology, but it's recorded in the ancient history, that there was a famous mythological ancestor figure for the Chinese, who in Chinese his name is Shen Nung, and he invented agriculture. And the Vietnamese myth is that his grandson, 3 generations from, in Vietnamese we call him Tung Nom, 3 generations from Tung Nom was a guy who was a king. And he was a king of southern China and this part of today's Vietnam. And he has 2 sons by 2 different wives. And one son he gives to rule the northern part, and the other son he gives to rule this part, with a country called Sit Quy. So this is the emergence of a political entity and some sort of a ruler with Vietnamese people in the heartland of today's Vietnam. Now remember, everybody from here on north up to the Yangtze are also Viet peoples. But this is the first sort of link in a continuous chain of rulers and states coming down to the present day state of Vietnam. Now, the significance of this I want to highlight is that in the Vietnamese mythology, they link themselves up to the same ancestor figure as the Chinese, i.e. they are equivalent to the Chinese. They are not inferior, they are not secondary, they are descended directly from the same origin point. So why should they have to feel themselves beholden to the Chinese for anything? Because they too go back to Sheng Nung. Now, the story is that this descendant from Sheng Nung, after Sit Kui, there's a particular king, Lac Lam, there's a mythology about Lac Lam Kuang and Ao Ke, and there's a king, Hum Vuong, who sets up a state called Vang Lang, which is around here, at about 2,800 BC. And there's a mythical date, which is pretty precise, 2,800 and something BC. Now, can we believe these myths? Because there are no historical records. Nothing was written down. There are no stone inscriptions. We have nothing except the myths that came down and get recorded 1,000 years later in a book like this. We do know that in Ban Cheong, Thailand, here, and other places around here, Bronze Age cultures have been found at 3,600 BC, all the way up. So we know there's a Bronze Age culture here before this myth. We also know there's bronze in this part of Vietnam. Bronze has been found. And you can look at various books about Vietnamese antiques and see ancient bronze ladles and things like that, and bronze drums. Bronze drums are later. But there is a Bronze Age culture all through Southeast Asia, different from China, not dependent on China. It has bronze before the Chinese had bronze, or at the same time the Chinese had bronze. It's independent. So I think we see the development of a culture, and in Vietnamese legends, for about 2,000 years, there are 18 dynasties, there are 18 kings of these Hum kings, which of course can't be true because then each king would have ruled like 170 years or something. But there were probably a line of descent, and there's some evidence from myths and origins that this society was matrifocal, because the succession of the kingship went to a son-in-law, did not go to the son of the king. It would go to the husband of a daughter. The advantage of this system, frankly, is that you get to choose a man who has demonstrated some intelligence or some capability. One of the problems with a patriarchal system, which we see perhaps with Queen Elizabeth and her sons in England, is that you're stuck with what you've got. Right? You have sons, and if the sons aren't, and this has been the problem of patriarchal monarchies all over the world forever. A guy comes along, he's very good, he's very accomplished, he sets up a kingdom, and maybe he has a son who's pretty good. Generally the grandson, third generation, raised in a palace, raised in luxury, lots of money, lots of girlfriends, whatever he wants, nobody ever tells him no. He's a spoiled brat. When he becomes king, he's generally a lousy king. The other way, if you put the descent to a son-in-law, you pick somebody who's in their late teens or early 20s, and you can see their character, you can see whether they're a good fighter, you can see how they get along with people, and you say, okay, I pick you, you marry my daughter, and you take over from me later on. But more importantly, evidence here for the power of the women's side of things. Now, far to the north in China, there are a large number of Chinese states, and they develop armies, they develop sophisticated bronze technology, Confucius, Mencius, they develop philosophy, they develop big buildings, a very sophisticated culture. The court dress, agriculture, towns are being built up, they have money, they're building roads, they have implements. Bronze comes up from the south, and iron comes up from the south, about 400 BC. With the arrival of iron, you get a change in military technology. Bronze is very expensive. It's hard to make a lot of bronze weapons. So Bronze Age cultures generally are aristocratic cultures. It's a small elite of fighters who have money to have the Bronze Age, the swords, the shields, the helmets, and chariots. When you have iron, you can mass produce iron weapons, swords and spears. So after the arrival of iron, the armies up in the north begin to grow. And the Chinese records will talk about a 1,000,000-man army, which I think that was probably too much, but clearly 10,000, maybe 100,000. Those are a lot of soldiers. You all may remember in China, there's these very famous big, tall clay statues of soldiers next to the king of Qin Shi Huang. Well, Qin Shi Huang was the guy who he organized the biggest and the best armies. He was the best general, and he conquered all the other Chinese lords. And he absorbed all the other states under his sole control. And he had so much power that he gave himself a new title. He took the title of Hoàng Đế, in Vietnamese, Hoàng Đế. And a Di is a human being who communicates with heaven. A Di is a sort of a sanctified, sainted human being who communicates directly with heaven and then tells the other human beings what to do. He has the mandate from heaven to order what human beings do. And Qin Shi Huang starts at the north, and then after he consolidates his control of the north under himself as a Dey, he moves south. And he ultimately moves south, and he conquers the kingdom which is around here, which is of the most southern Vietnamese kingdom. So I'm jumping over some of the characters, the names of the people we know about there. But before I do that, some Vietnamese scholars who write about this think it's very significant that the name of this old Vietnamese kingdom here was Văn Lang. Văn is the word for culture, for literature. And they want to make a point that the Vietnamese early on took a term for themselves which emphasized the intellect, which emphasized intellectual sophistication and culture of the person, of the individual person. And so making the point that the Vietnamese from early on had a respect for thought, for intelligence, for thinking, for individualism. The other thing that's happening in this period of the Bronze Age period is Vietnamese have great belief in spirits, in tongue, in spiritual powers, in saints, in protective deities, the mountain spirit, the water spirit, the spirit of this place, the spirit of that place. And they call upon, because they feel themselves, I'm thinking, as individuals without necessarily a lot of power, you call on all these spirits to come help you. And you do this in a way very similar in our times, I think, to the way Catholics invoke the Mother of Jesus Christ, Mary, or some of the saints. You're invoking spiritual protection. It's like you want a loving father or a loving mother to come and protect you and take care of you. Because here you are all alone like this, but the bad guys are coming, or fate is bad, or it's a bad harvest, or something's happened. Your child is sick, you don't know what to do. So you go to a temple, you go somewhere, you go out in the woods, you pray to a powerful spirit, which is again a source of power in the cosmos, which you as an individual can access. And so that's part of a Vietnamese tradition at this time. The other thing we see in some of these symbolisms is conflicts and tensions. One of the stories about Lac Lam Quân, who was this descendant, he's supposed to be a dragon lord. He marries a woman, Ao Ke, who is a bird or a fairy or sort of a sky spirit. He's a mountain water spirit. She's a sky heavenly spirit. They have 100 children, or 100 eggs. And at one point he goes to her and says, look, I'm the water element with yin and yang. You're the fire element with yin and yang. We just can't get along with each other. So you take 50 kids and go down to the sea, and I'll take 50 kids and I'll go up to the mountains. And those are sort of the ancestors of the Lac Viets and the Ao Viets, two kinds of Viets. What's interesting to me is built into this story, and the Vietnamese, one of the Vietnamese phrases for themselves is, children of dragons, grandchildren of immortals. Kong Rom Chao Tiang. In being a Vietnamese is a tension between two inconsistent elements, water and fire. And how do you get harmony and peace if you've got two different things going on inside you? and Zung are two different forces. There's another mythological story from this period about the struggle of the mountain spirit and the water spirit for the daughter of the Vietnamese king. He's got a beautiful daughter. These two spirits come up. Each one wants the girl, and they have a huge fight between them. Again, tension. The other thing, however, that you can see with this notion of the mountain spirit and the water spirit, dragons on one side, sort of birds on the others, is an expression which has come down to Vietnamese of the present time, which is a symbol for the land of mountains and rivers. No nước, nuôi some nuôi. If you want to talk about Vietnam, if you want to talk about Vietnamese patriotism, if you want to talk about loyalty to where you come from, many times the expression you use is you must answer the call of mountains and rivers. As just said all over the place. In fact, Juan and I are now translating a novel by a Vietnamese writer, and she uses this expression a number of times in 2010. Nuôi some, nom nước. And again, mountains are high, rivers and water are low. Zung. Inconsistencies which somehow have to mix and find themselves. Now, they can either mix and find themselves through fate, through these geomancy or fortune telling, or they do it themselves, or the individual through his or her own duk can balance these things out and create a sense of efficacy, of power, of peace, a resting point in the cosmos. And we're talking about these concepts now way before the time of Jesus Christ. So about the time of Jesus Christ, the Chinese have come and invaded. Now, Qin Shi Huang, this great powerful Chinese ruler, dies. His son is very weak. His general down here declares himself independent, creates an independent country called Nan Yuet, Southern Yuet, the Southern Viets. So he's ruling the Southern Viets all around here. He also takes a title for himself to give himself legal and moral equivalency to the ruler of the Chinese in the north. The Chinese in the north is calling himself in Vietnamese Hoàng Đế. This guy, Triều Da, calls himself Nam Đế, the day of the south. Now, a day is, again, this being who can communicate directly with heaven. So what this man, who's Chinese, by the way, but he's ruling all these southern people, and he wants to assert his independence from the guys up north. So he calls himself a day. What he is saying is that he in the south has an autonomous right to pray to heaven, to listen to heaven, to create his own laws, to have his own fortune and destiny under heaven. He does not have to listen to the day of the north or the back day. So that, I think, politically, culturally, ideologically, is very, very significant. Okay, up to the north, a new dynasty emerges for the Chinese, the Han dynasty, famous dynasty. Third Han king gets his armies together, starts moving down to the south. The son of this guy, who's the Nam Đế, recognizes the approach of power, realizes, I think, that he can't fight the Han Chinese, so he says, okay, I will accept you to be the day of everybody. I'll just call myself a king, and you leave me alone, and I'll leave you alone. And the Han emperor agrees. If you no longer call yourself a day, if you become under my protection, and you can be independent. I'm not going to appoint your commanders. I'm not going to appoint your district chiefs and things like that. But you're under my supervision. So that's agreed to. So then, bit by bit, the Han dynasty imposes direct rule. Chinese administrators start coming in, and we're going to focus now on this part of Vietnam. Down here, there are some people, there's some Cham people who live along here, who are, they're not Mon Khmer. There's lots of issues as to where the Cham come from. They're related to people in Indonesia. And they're probably, they may have come up from Indonesia, and they lived along the coasts. And they were sailing, and they were growing rice, but they're also probably, they traded. And they may have been pirates. They may have put together expeditions and gone out and captured things and brought them back. But we're going to focus in on this area here. Now, bit by bit, the Han Dynasty Chinese begin to impose Han law and administrative structures, district chiefs, and in particular, about 38 AD, the Han are insisting that the Vietnamese adopt Chinese marriages. Now, what's a marriage? You go to some place, you sign a piece of paper, husband and wife, you're married, big deal. Well, when you think about it, what a Chinese marriage is the bringing in of a daughter-in-law to the patriarchy, to the patrilineage, which, by the way, the Chinese form of marriage is what the Vietnamese use today. And there are two basic parts to it. One is the dam hoi, where the husband's family, as a family, on behalf of the family, goes to call on the bride's family as a family and ask for the young woman as a bride to come join their family as a daughter-in-law. And her family agrees. And this gets to the whole point of arranged marriages and things like this. And then there's the wedding, which is when you go dongzao, you go to the husband's family, goes to the family of the daughter-in-law, picks her up and takes her away. And there's supposed to be at that point, right, a real emotional crisis between the daughter and her mother, because she is leaving her mother forever, in theory. And in the Chinese side, it's pretty true. Because in the Chinese side, once a daughter has left and gone over, she's gone. She's no longer yours. She's with that side. She's with the husband's family. And in the Chinese pattern, this pattern of Chinese patriarchal structure, the function of the wife, woman, mother is to serve the altars of the husband's ancestors. So she's supposed to do that in various ways. She is supposed to produce sons for that family. She's supposed to cook. She's supposed to run the ceremonies and basically be a very dutiful, filial, obedient daughter-in-law. So let's imagine now Vietnam, 38 AD, and the Chinese are saying, no, no, this is how you got to do it. And the Vietnamese are saying, no, 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 women, we do it our way. We have sons-in-laws, our women are important. We don't want to be subordinate to men. Well, now there's a governor general who comes in to Vietnam from the Chinese, Do Dinh, and apparently he's also very cruel, and he's insisting on all these things. And one of the things he does is he kills the husband of a princess who is coming out, a Vietnamese princess who comes from this Hom Bang dynasty, the tradition of the aristocratic families. And her name is Trung Trác, and she has a younger sister, Trung Nhi. And these two ladies in 39 AD start a rebellion against the Chinese. Now, the significance, this is very famous in Vietnamese history, and this is a big deal. The Hai Ba Trung, the two Trung ladies, the two Trung sisters. My sense is that basically Vietnamese look to this as an expression in 39 AD of Vietnamese independence. We don't want to be ruled by the Chinese. We are different from you. We have our own culture, our own land, our own mountains and rivers. Heaven has given us our own right to be ourselves, and we're going to fight you. The thing I find rather interesting is that the first big revolt is led by women, not men. I think there's significance to this on two levels. One, the women were being threatened by this new Chinese culture. Because it's pretty clear that if you go to the Chinese patriarchy, you're going to lose, a lot of your overt power and control. And secondly, the Vietnamese followed the women. I mean, how many revolts were led by women around the world in 39 AD? So, Jesus Christ was crucified in, 33 AD, I think, or somewhere along in there. I mean, clearly thousands of Vietnamese men and women, but mostly Vietnamese men, were willing to grab their swords, go off and fight the Chinese, led by these two women. Now, the revolt is crushed by a very famous Chinese general, Ma Vieng, who comes and crushes the revolt. And we have now about 900 more years of Chinese rule. It's an interesting period, because my submission is that the Chinese may have been ruling superficially, but underneath, inside, these Vietnamese were keeping their Vietnamese-ness with some modifications, but they kept their Vietnamese-ness. The other Viets from the other side of this mountain range on up to Shanghai basically became, over the centuries, more and more Chinese. Now, there's a reason for that. More Chinese moved from the north down here. There was more intermarriage. Up north, there was more intermarriage. There was more direct access to Chinese culture, civilization, education. You can understand it. However, even today, there's similarities in pronunciation and sounding between modern Vietnamese and the regional dialects of southern China. So if you go to Hong Kong, or you go to Guangdong, or you go to Guangzhou, or Canton, or these places, you will hear the way the local people speak. It sounds more like Vietnamese, because there's an ancient sort of affinity there. The Chinese that we hear most of the time, Mandarin, comes from the north, sounds very, very different. The Chinese, the official Chinese from Peking, or what you hear on the movies and everything like that. One of the key differences is the Chinese, the Mandarin Chinese, apparently under the influence of Manchus and Mongols and other people, dropped initial hard consonants, and they dropped final consonants. So Chinese is very soft and lots of like these kinds of sounds. Vietnamese still have hard consonants, N's, M's, NG's, ng, ng, ng. Vietnamese has hard final consonants, the T's, TH's, D's. So that there was something going on with these people here, which I don't have an answer for. Something going on with these people here that they cared enough about themselves to try to preserve their own sense, their family patterns, their language, their values, their beliefs in individualism, in fate. But something else comes in about 200 AD. Buddhism. Buddhism comes to Vietnam before it comes to China. Buddhism doesn't come to China until about 600 AD. And Buddhism comes to China from the West. Buddhism goes from India over here up to today's Afghanistan, around up into the deserts to Western China, and then through Western China into the North China. And the Buddhist dynasties are 500 AD. The first great dynasty of China, the Sui dynasty, 800. We have records, 200 AD, 250 AD, 300. Scholars are here writing sutras, Buddhist sutras from India. The supposition is they came by sea. They came by sea, by boats, from India down here, because we have Buddhism down here, the Khmer Empire. They come by sea down here, and they come around, and they come up here. So part of this Vietnamese-ness brings in something of this Buddhist teaching. This is where I think this concept of Phuc, as in Phuc Đức, Phuc, good fortune. The Phuc concept is coming from Buddhism, that there's some kind of good fortune that you get because of what your ancestors have done. And Buddhist monks begin to emerge, and Buddhist monks are going to be very influential advisors around 939, around 1000, when the Vietnamese revolt against the Chinese and push them out. They're Buddhist monks, Van Han in particular, who advise the kings, who have a philosophy, who have writing, who have understanding. So that means there are going to be about 600 years of Buddhism in Vietnam with the Vietnamese people. So Chinese rule at the top, but the matrifocal family life is still going on. Buddhism is coming in, and the Vietnamese never lose their sense of mountains and rivers. And in about 600, there is a revolt by one Vietnamese with the family name of Ly, Ly Bon. But when he drives out the Chinese for a while because they're weak. The Tang dynasty hasn't come up yet. China's weak. So he figures he's got an opportunity. He organizes people, has an army, drives them out, only lasts about 10 years. But he takes as a reign title, Ly Nam Day, Ly the Southern Day. So here we have about 600 years after this guy who had this kingdom of Nanyue, this reemergence of this concept of Nam Day. My sense is it's not a reemergence, it's a survival. That these people kept in mind the sense that they could have their own relationship with heaven. And by the way, if you have geomancy, if you read faces, if you have fortune telling, if you consult yin and yang, that's how you know what heaven wants. You don't need to ask the Chinese. You can consult all these things because yin and yang is moving all the time around you, and you can read yin and yang for yourself. As an individual, as an autonomous individual, you can find guidance from heaven, and you can shape your own morality and your ethics. So under this period of Chinese rule, quietly, we don't have a lot of historic evidence for it, some notion of Vietnamese-ness is, if you will, locking in. And what happens then is, again, responding to Chinese opportunities, the Tang dynasty collapses about 900. And China breaks apart into very weak dynasties and feuding dynasties, and China's going to be weak for a couple hundred years until the Sung dynasty gets into control. But as the Tang are getting weak, another Vietnamese who has some magical quality to him rises up. His name is Ngo Quyen. He rises up and leads the Vietnamese. So what the history says about him is, think of this in terms of fatalism. When he was born, a bright light filled the house, and it unusually illuminated everything. He had 3 black spots on his chest. Like remember face reading? If a little baby is born, they got 3 like moles, probably just 3 ordinary moles, 3 moles on his chest. Who put those moles there? Heaven. And if those moles are strategically located, right, that means this little baby has got some special power inside him. And this was seen very strange. Oh, and his face, his tung, they even have a reference in here to face reading. Te tung jola la. It's very strange. And the conclusion was that he could become the boss of one region, Lam Chu, Một Phương. And so they gave him the name of Quyen, which means authority or power. So here is about 900 Vietnamese, having lived under the Chinese for about 1,000 years. This little baby is born. Notice, he's not even born to a royal family or necessarily a powerful family or a wealth. He's just born. And people write, they study, oh, this kid. Strange light in the house. Think of our Christian story at the time of Easter, when Jesus is born, and then there's a star, and the Magi come, and all this. You know. So this boy grows up, and people are willing to follow him. And so he organizes an army, beats the Chinese, drives them out, and becomes king, and also takes the title of Day somewhere in here. I can't remember. No, he doesn't take a day. Sorry. He doesn't call himself a day. Anyway, he dies. And in a pattern we see, people do not accept his sons to be of the same stature. They don't have wheat in. So the rule cannot go on. And the sons lose control, and there's a period called the 12 Lords. So the territory is divided up among 12 warlords who are fighting with each other. And they can't control things, and it's chaos and anarchy. Then another guy comes along who's something of a character, Din Bo Lin, who also has some special stuff when he was born, but he's also, as a young boy, he's from a very poor family, and he's out with the other boys taking care of the water buffalo, but he shows himself, and some of us have experienced with other kids, other boys, he's kind of like a gang leader. I mean, he's got like this natural talent for organizing the other boys and beating up somebody and saying, you listen to me, I'm the boss. And so he sort of distinguishes himself as a young boy as being a tough guy, a leader, he gets things done, he's decisive. And so he rises up on the military side, beats the other 12 guys, and declares himself king. Din Tien Wang, Din the First Wang. And what is his famous thing? Oh yeah, he has in his palace, which you can still go see the ruins of, he's got a tiger cage where he puts tigers, and so that's where he punishes criminals. He throws them down with the tigers so the tigers will eat him. And he's a very tough guy. And he dies. And again, his sons do not have this wheatin, this power, this trustworthiness, whatever it is. So the sons cannot establish political rule, and there's more chaos. And then one of his generals comes up by the name of Lê Wan, and he becomes the king, and he takes the title of Day, and he calls himself Dai Han, Lê Dai Han, which is, there's one book, quite interesting. If I can find that. Van Hoa Thăng Minh Dai Viet. This guy, two guys, Pham Tuong and Viet Hoang. Viet Hoang is a pen name because this guy, the communists don't like him at all. And if he has no permission to write this book, so that's his pen name, and Pham Tuong is kind of covering for him. So this is a theory about Vietnamese national spirit going back to this period. And he gives credit to this guy, Lê Quang, for coming up with this name Dai Han, which is kind of a philosophy